Hello, especially for the Dirty Secrets channel.
Dr. James Carter's fingers moved with precision as he completed the final sutures on his patient's heart. The operating theater was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional metallic clink of instruments being placed on trays. "Beautiful work as always, Dr. Carter," his surgical assistant murmured as they began closing the chest cavity. James nodded, maintaining his focus. This was his third surgery of the day, and despite the complexity of the procedure, his hands showed no sign of fatigue. 45, he was at the peak of his career, head of cardiothoracic surgery at Boston Memorial, published in dozens of medical journals and on the shortlist for the hospital's next chief of surgery. The patient's vitals remained stable as the team finished. James stepped back, peeling off his gloves and surgical gown. "Another life saved, doctor," said the anesthesiologist with admiration. James allowed himself a small smile. "That's what we're here for." Outside the OR, he checked his watch, 6:15 p.m. His wife, Elizabeth, would be expecting him home by 8 for their anniversary dinner. 13 years of marriage. He texted her quickly, "Surgery successful. On my way soon. Love you." His phone vibrated almost immediately with another message, but this one came from a different number, one saved simply as M. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching before opening it. "Miss you. When are you coming home to us? Lily has her recital tomorrow." James felt the familiar twist in his gut, equal parts guilt and anticipation. He typed back, "Flying out tomorrow morning. Tell her daddy can't wait to see her shine." He pocketed his phone and headed to his office, where a framed photo of Elizabeth sat on his desk. Next to his computer was a small calendar where he meticulously tracked his schedule, lectures, surgeries, and medical conferences that took him to Chicago at least twice a month. No one at Boston Memorial questioned why the brilliant Dr. Carter needed to attend so many conferences. No one suspected that for the past 8 years, he had been living a double life. In Boston, he was the devoted husband of Elizabeth Carter, philanthropist and hospital board member. In Chicago, he was Jim to Melissa Parker and father to 7-year-old Lily. 2 cities, 2 homes, 2 families, one carefully constructed lie that was about to unravel. Elizabeth Carter stood in their Beacon Hill townhouse, arranging white roses, James's favorite, in a crystal vase. At 43, she remained as elegant as the day they'd met at a hospital fundraiser 15 years ago. Her dark hair was swept into a chignon, her black dress simple but expensive. She'd made reservations at L'Espalier, the restaurant where James had proposed. She checked her phone again, rereading his message. Her husband was a hero, saving lives daily. If his work sometimes kept him away, she understood the sacrifice. That's what she told her friends when they marveled at her patience with his frequent travels. "How do you handle all those conferences?" her friend Caroline had asked just last week. Elizabeth had smiled. "His work is important, and absence makes the heart grow fonder." The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Courier stood outside with a package. "Delivery for Dr. Carter," he said. Elizabeth signed for it, assuming it was another medical journal or perhaps an early anniversary gift James had ordered. The return address was unfamiliar. Back in the kitchen, curiosity got the better of her. She opened the package to find a child's drawing of 3 stick figures, a tall man, a woman, and a small girl. Across the top in crayon was written, "I love you, Daddy. Good luck at your big surgery. Love, Lily." Elizabeth froze, the paper trembling in her hands. Perhaps it was meant for another Dr. Carter? But the address was correct, and the package included a woman's note. "James, Lily insisted on sending this for good luck. Call us when you're done in the OR. We love you, The room seemed to tilt. Elizabeth steadied herself against the counter, her mind refusing to process what was in front of her. This had to be a mistake. James would have an explanation. She placed the drawing back in the package and carried it to his home office. She would wait until after their anniversary dinner. She wouldn't ruin their special night with what must be a misunderstanding. But as she set the package on his desk, her elbow knocked over a stack of papers. As she gathered them, a receipt fluttered to the floor, a jewelry store in Chicago dated 3 weeks ago. The item purchased was a locket engraved with the words, "To Lily, all my love, Daddy." Elizabeth sat heavily in James's chair, the room suddenly airless. 13 years of marriage, and now this evidence of... What? A child? Another woman? She began to search through his desk drawers, her hands shaking, her perfect world beginning to crack. Melissa Parker hummed as she helped her daughter into her ballet shoes. 38, she had the tired eyes of a single mother, though she wasn't truly single. James, her Jim, provided for them generously, even if he couldn't be there every day. "Is Daddy really coming to my recital?" Lily asked, her blue eyes so like her father's, wide with hope. "He promised, didn't he?" Melissa said, smiling. "And Daddy always keeps his promises. Except the promise that he would leave his wife," a bitter voice in her head whispered. 8 years she'd been waiting. 8 years of explanations to friends about Lily's father who traveled for work. 8 years of being the secret, the other woman, the almost wife. They had met when she was a pharmaceutical sales rep visiting Boston Memorial. James had been charming, attentive. He'd told her his marriage was already falling apart, just a shell they maintained for appearances. Melissa had believed him, had fallen for his intelligence and warmth, had accepted his limitations. When she discovered she was pregnant, James had seemed genuinely torn. He couldn't leave Elizabeth yet, he explained. Timing was wrong. But he set Melissa up in Chicago, visited regularly, became a part-time father to Lily. "He loves us," Melissa told herself, adjusting Lily's tutu. "He's just caught in a difficult situation." Her phone chimed with James's message about the recital. She smiled, showing Lily. "See? Daddy can't wait to see you dance." After tucking Lily into bed with stories about the father who adored her, Melissa opened a bottle of wine and stared at the framed photo of the three of them at the Chicago Zoo last summer. James looked happy there, relaxed in a way he rarely was, always checking his phone for messages from Boston. She opened her laptop and clicked on a folder of photos from their trip to Lake Geneva. As she scrolled, something caught her eye, a notification from their joint credit card account which James used to support them. There was an unusual charge, a dinner reservation at L'Espalier in Boston for tomorrow night. But tomorrow was Lily's recital. James had promised to be here, had booked his flight months ago. Frowning, Melissa did a quick search for L'Espalier. An anniversary dinner, perhaps? But James and Elizabeth's anniversary wasn't until... She checked the calendar where she marked James's visits. Their anniversary was tomorrow. The wine glass nearly slipped from her fingers. All these years, had he been lying about the state of his marriage? About his intentions? With trembling fingers, she began to search for more information about Dr. and Mrs. James Carter of Boston. Elizabeth sat in James's home office until midnight, surrounded by evidence of her husband's betrayal. A hidden phone with thousands of texts to M. Bank statements showing regular transfers to an account in Chicago. Flight itineraries that matched his supposed conference dates perfectly. And photos. So many photos stored on a password-protected external hard drive she'd found in a locked desk drawer. Password had been easy, Lily's birthday, which she'd found in a calendar entry. Elizabeth stared at images of James with his other family. In one, he held a newborn wrapped in pink. In another, he pushed a toddler on a swing. In the most recent, he stood with his arm around a pretty brunette, a grade school girl between them, all smiling in front of a Christmas tree. The girl, Lily, had his eyes. Elizabeth couldn't deny it. 8 years, she whispered to the empty room. The affairs she might have forgiven. But this, a child, a parallel life, years of elaborate deception, this was beyond comprehension. The roses she'd arranged sat forgotten. The anniversary dinner reservation would go unused. Instead, Elizabeth made 2 calls, one to her attorney, another to a private investigator who owed her a favor from her days working in corporate law before she'd left her career to support James's. "I need everything you can find on a Melissa Parker in Chicago," she told the investigator. "And I need surveillance on my husband when he travels there tomorrow." That done, she poured herself a drink and waited for James to come home. He arrived just after midnight, looking tired but satisfied after his successful surgery. His smile faded when he found Elizabeth in his office, the evidence of his double life laid out before her. "I can explain," he began. "Can you?" Elizabeth's voice was ice. "Explain 8 years of lies? Explain your daughter? Explain why I've been funding your second family with my inheritance?" James paled. "It's complicated, Elizabeth." "No, it's quite simple." She stood eerily calm. "You're a liar. A cheat. Thief, actually, since you've been using my money. And tomorrow, while you're at Lily's ballet recital, I'll be meeting with my lawyers." "You don't understand," James said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I have responsibilities to Lily, to Melissa, and none to me, to our vows." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Save it for the judge, James. I've already copied everything. You might want to call Melissa and warn her that your perfect arrangement is over." James stared at her, his brilliant surgeon's mind frantically calculating. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Money? The house? Name it and it's yours. But please don't do this." "My reputation, your reputation?" Elizabeth's voice rose for the first time. "You should have thought about that before you built a life on lies. Get out of my house, James. Your things will be on the sidewalk tomorrow." As he stood there, stunned, Elizabeth walked past him, pausing at the door. "Oh, and happy anniversary." James spent the night in a hotel, his mind racing through scenarios. By morning, he had a plan. He would fly to Chicago as scheduled, explain everything to Melissa, then return to Boston to negotiate with Elizabeth. Surely between his salary and her inheritance, there was enough money to satisfy both women. His reputation might survive a divorce scandal. Many of his colleagues had been through messy separations. But if the full truth came out, the deliberate deception, the double life, his career would be ruined. As his plane landed in Chicago, his phone exploded with messages. The first was from his lawyer. "Elizabeth has filed for divorce citing fraud. Call me ASAP." The second was from the hospital administrator. "Urgent meeting required upon your return. The board has questions about financial irregularities." The third was from Melissa. "We need to talk. I know about Elizabeth. About your anniversary. About everything." James felt the walls closing in. How had Melissa found out? He took a taxi directly to her apartment, rehearsing explanations, apologies, promises. He found her sitting rigid at the kitchen table, her laptop open to a social media page showing Elizabeth at a hospital gala, James by her side. "You told me your marriage was over in all but name," Melissa said without greeting him. "You told me you stayed for appearances, for your career." "Mel, please. 8 years, James. 8 years I've waited, believing you'd leave her once the time was right. 8 years I've let Lily think her father loves her while you've been living a lie." "I do love Lily," James protested. "And you. I've provided for you, haven't I? Given you both a good life?" Melissa's laugh was hollow. "A good half-life, you mean? Perhaps of your time. Stolen holidays. A child who thinks it's normal that her father visits like some out-of-town relative." "I've done my best," James said, feeling control slipping away. "Elizabeth knows everything now. She's filing for divorce. We can finally be together properly. You still don't get it, do you?" Melissa stood, her eyes cold. "I don't want to be with a man who could lie so completely for so long. To her. To me. To our daughter. "What about Lily's recital?" James asked, suddenly remembering why he'd come. "I told her you got held up in surgery." "Another lie to protect her from your lies." Melissa's voice broke. "I want you to leave. I'll have Lily call you tomorrow, but I want you out of my house and out of my life." As James turned to go, shell-shocked, Melissa added, "Oh, and Elizabeth's private investigator has been taking pictures since you arrived. I'm guessing those will show up in the divorce proceedings." James stumbled out to the street, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. James returned to Boston to find his office at the hospital sealed with administrative tape. His assistant couldn't meet his eyes as she handed him a letter requesting his immediate presence at an emergency board meeting. "What's going on, Sarah?" he asked. "There are allegations, Dr. Carter, about misuse of hospital funds, falsified conference attendance records." James felt the blood drain from his face. He had occasionally used hospital funds for his flights to Chicago, justifying it by giving talks at the medical school there. Had Elizabeth uncovered that too? The board meeting was worse than he imagined. Not only had Elizabeth provided evidence of his financial improprieties, but the hospital's internal audit had uncovered more fraudulent expense reports, travel reimbursements for conferences he'd never attended. "Given the seriousness of these allegations, we have no choice but to suspend you pending a full investigation," the board chair said, looking disappointed. "Your surgical privileges are revoked effective immediately." "My patients," James began, "will be reassigned. We've already contacted Dr. Patel to take over your cases." James felt dizzy. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for, gone in an instant. Inside the hospital, reporters were already gathering. Someone had leaked the story. James ducked into a taxi, giving his hotel address. He couldn't go home, Elizabeth had changed the locks. His phone rang. It was his lawyer. "James, it's worse than we thought. Elizabeth isn't just filing for divorce, she's filing criminal charges for financial fraud. And she's going after everything, the house, your savings, even your pension." "She can't do that," James protested. "She can and she will. She has evidence that you used her inheritance money to support your Chicago family without her knowledge. That's wire fraud across state lines, potentially a federal offense." James ended the call and sat on the hotel bed, head in his hands. In just 24 hours, he had lost both families, his career, and was facing potential criminal charges. How had it unraveled so quickly? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Lily at her ballet recital, face glowing as she took a bow. She was amazing. "You missed it." Again. And this time I had to tell her why. The message was from Melissa. James threw the phone against the wall, watching it shatter like the life he had built on lies. The Boston Globe's headline was merciless. "Prominent surgeon led double life." The article detailed everything: the two families, the financial fraud, the suspension from the hospital. It included a statement from Elizabeth's lawyer, characterizing James as a pathological liar who betrayed not only his wife but the hospital and patients who trusted him. There was no statement from Melissa. She had taken Lily and gone to stay with her parents in Michigan, away from the media circus. James's lawyer advised him to lay low until their first court appearance, but isolation only left him alone with his thoughts. How had he justified his actions all these years? Each deception had seemed necessary at the time, each lie building on the last until the truth was buried under years of careful fiction. He had never intended to hurt anyone. He had loved both women in different ways, Elizabeth for her grace and intelligence, Melissa for her warmth and the child they shared. He had convinced himself that maintaining both relationships was the kindest solution, sparing both women pain. Now he had destroyed them all. His phone, a new one since he'd broken the last, rang with an unfamiliar number. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Dr. Carter." The voice was professional, female. "This is Sandra Wong from the State Medical Board." We're initiating proceedings to review your license in light of recent allegations. James closed his eyes. Of course. The final blow. Without his medical license, he was nothing. After the call, he sat in his hotel room, staring at the wall. On the table lay the scattered remains of his life, divorce papers from Elizabeth, a restraining order from Melissa, the suspension letter from the hospital, and now the medical board inquiry. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find a court courier with another envelope. Elizabeth's lawyers had filed for an emergency freeze on all his assets. As the courier left, James noticed a man in the hallway taking photos. More media. He slammed the door and leaned against it, sliding to the floor. For the first time, the reality of his situation hit him fully. There would be no escaping the consequences. No clever explanation would fix this. No surgeon's precision could excise the damage he had caused. His phone chimed with a message. Despite everything, a spark of hope made him check it. It was from Lily's phone, presumably sent by Melissa. Lily wants to know if what the kids at school are saying is true. That you have another wife and you've been lying to us. I don't know what to tell her anymore. James put his head in his hands and wept. Courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when James arrived for his arraignment. Charges were extensive: wire fraud, misappropriation of funds, filing false tax returns. His lawyer had negotiated his surrender to avoid the humiliation of an arrest, but it did little to mitigate his public disgrace. Inside, Elizabeth sat with her legal team, her face impassive. She didn't look at him as he entered. Melissa had refused to come to Boston, but her deposition would be used by the prosecution. She had provided years of financial records showing how James had supported their Chicago household, money that had partially come from Elizabeth's inheritance and from fraudulent hospital reimbursements. The judge set bail at $1 million. James's lawyer leaned over and whispered, "With your accounts frozen, can you come up with 10%? James shook his head. His parents were deceased. His brother wasn't speaking to him, and he had no friends willing to put up $100,000 for his bail. Then you'll be remanded to custody until trial, the lawyer said grimly. As the bailiff approached to take him away, James finally caught Elizabeth's eye. He expected hatred or triumph, but what he saw was worse, absolute indifference, as if he were a stranger. That night in his cell, James faced the reality of his new life. From respected surgeon to criminal defendant. From husband and father to pariah. The fall had been swift and absolute. His lawyer visited the next morning with updates, none good. The hospital was cooperating fully with prosecutors, providing records of every expense James had ever submitted. Elizabeth's forensic accountants had tracked every penny he'd diverted to Chicago. The medical board had fast-tracked their review, with license revocation likely. "Is there any good news?" James asked hollowly. The lawyer hesitated. "Melissa has agreed to allow supervised visits with Lily after the trial, regardless of the outcome. She says Lily still asks for you." It was a small mercy in an ocean of consequences, but James clung to it like a drowning man. Days later, a plea deal was offered. Guilty pleas to reduce charges in exchange for no jail time, just probation, community service, and restitution. James would lose his medical license, but might eventually be able to teach or consult. "Take it," his lawyer advised. "A trial will only expose more details, none favorable to you." James signed the plea agreement, feeling nothing. The illustrious career of Dr. James Carter ended not with awards or accolades, but with the scratch of a pen on a confession of fraud. Elizabeth sat alone in the Beacon Hill townhouse, surrounded by photographs she hadn't yet taken down, her wedding day, vacations with James, charity galas where they'd been the golden couple. 13 years of memories, all tainted now. Her phone rang constantly, friends, reporters, even a Hollywood producer interested in her story. She ignored them all. The divorce would be finalized next week. Plea deal had been accepted. James would avoid prison but lose everything else. Elizabeth should have felt vindicated, but victory tasted like ashes. How did I not know? She asked her reflection. There must have been signs, the too frequent trips, the secretive phone calls, the occasional mention of names he would quickly explain away. Perhaps she hadn't wanted to know. Their life had been comfortable, prestigious. James was respected, their marriage envied. She had built her identity around being Dr. Carter's wife, had given up her own career to support his. Her attorney had called that morning with news that James had agreed to all terms of the divorce. She would keep the house, the investments, her family money. He would keep his crushing debt and ruined reputation. A strange restlessness filled her. Destroying James had consumed her for months, but now that it was done, what remained? Who was Elizabeth Carter without the lies that had structured her life? The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw a woman with a small girl, a girl with James's eyes. Elizabeth froze. Then, slowly, she opened the door. "Mrs. Carter," the woman asked. "I'm Melissa Parker. This is Lily. We thought it was time we met." Melissa hadn't planned to come to Boston. But after weeks of Lily's questions, of seeing her daughter confused and hurt, she had booked the tickets impulsively. "We're going to meet your fathers." "Other family," she told Lily, struggling to find words that wouldn't deepen the child's pain. They had checked into a hotel near the courthouse, watched from a distance as James was led away in handcuffs. Lily had cried, not understanding why her father was being treated like a criminal. "Did he do something bad?" she had asked. "He made mistakes," Melissa had answered carefully. "Adult mistakes that hurt people." Now, standing on Elizabeth's doorstep, Melissa wondered if she'd made a mistake herself. But Lily deserved some closure, some understanding of her complicated family. And maybe, in a strange way, she and Elizabeth needed it too. Elizabeth led them to a formal living room, offering tea with hands that trembled slightly. Two women studied each other, rivals, victims, unwilling participants in James's deception. "I didn't know about you," Elizabeth said finally. "Not until the drawing Lily sent." Melissa nodded. "I knew James was married, but he told me it was a marriage in name only. That you lived separate lives." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "He told me he was at medical conferences while he was with you." They fell silent, watching Lily, who was examining photos on the mantel. "Is this my dad?" she asked, pointing to a picture of James in surgical scrubs. Elizabeth nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, that's him at the hospital where he worked. He fixed people's hearts," Lily said proudly. The women exchanged a glance, awareness passing between them. Whatever James had done to them, this child was innocent. And despite everything, he had been a loving father to her. "Yes," Elizabeth said gently. "He was very good at fixing hearts." As they talked, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness, something unexpected happened. Their shared anger toward James became a connection, a peculiar bond formed through mutual betrayal. When it was time to leave, Elizabeth knelt before Lily. "It was very nice to meet you," she said. "Maybe you and your mom can visit again sometime." Melissa, watching them, made a decision. "We're moving back to Chicago next week. If you'd like to stay in touch with Lily, I wouldn't object." Elizabeth looked surprised, then grateful. "I'd like that very much." As they left the townhouse, Melissa felt a weight lift. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo James's deceptions, but she could choose how to move forward. And she chose compassion for Lily, for Elizabeth, and maybe someday for James himself. 5 years passed. James Carter, once a renowned surgeon, now taught anatomy at a community college under a different name. Through serving his probation and paying restitution, he had moved to a small Oregon town where no one knew his past. He lived simply in a one-bedroom apartment, his walls bare of the certificates and awards that had once defined him. His only luxury was a computer, which he used for weekly video calls with Lily, now 12 and flourishing despite the trauma of her early years. Melissa had allowed the contact after James completed therapy, a condition she'd insisted on. Their conversations were strictly about Lily's life, never about their shared past. Elizabeth had sold the Boston townhouse and returned to practicing law, specializing in cases involving financial fraud. She had found purpose in her pain, using her experience to help others who had been deceived by those they trusted. Remarkably, she and Melissa had maintained contact, united by their determination that Lily should not suffer for her father's sins. Elizabeth had no children of her own, and her role as a kind of honorary aunt to Lily gave her a connection she had never expected. James kept track of both women from a distance. Elizabeth's law career was flourishing according to public records. Melissa had started a small business that was doing well based on her social media. He took no credit for their resilience but felt a complicated pride in their strength. On a rainy Tuesday, James checked his mail to find a letter from the medical board. They had reviewed his case and, given his completion of all court-ordered restitution and his voluntary work at a free clinic, were willing to consider reinstating his license with severe restrictions, teaching only no patient care. It was more than he dared hope for, a small step toward redemption. That evening, during his call with Lily, she mentioned that Elizabeth had visited Chicago for her birthday. "She and Mom are friends now," Lily said casually. "It's weird, but kind of nice. She taught me how to play chess." James nodded, a lump in his throat. "That's good, sweetheart." After they hung up, he sat in his quiet apartment, reflecting on the ruins of the life he'd built and destroyed. He had lost almost everything, his career, his reputation, both families he had tried to maintain. But from those ruins, the women he had hurt had built something new. Elizabeth had found her voice, Melissa her independence. And Lily was growing up surrounded by strong women who had chosen forgiveness over bitterness. James would never fully repair what he had broken. Consequences of his deception would follow him forever. But perhaps in the smallest of ways, he could begin to rebuild himself, not as the brilliant, admired Dr. Carter, but as a man who had faced his failures and accepted them. He opened his laptop and began to write emails, one to the medical board accepting their offer, one to Melissa asking if they might discuss in-person visits with Lily, and finally, after much hesitation, one to Elizabeth. Contained just 3 sentences. "I've never properly apologized for what I did to you. No explanation can justify it, and no words can undo it. But I am deeply, truly sorry for the pain I caused." He didn't expect forgiveness or even a response. Some debts could never be fully repaid. But acknowledgement was a starting point, a foundation for whatever came next. Side his window, the rain had stopped. A new day was coming, bringing with it no guarantees except the certainty that actions had consequences, that healing took time, and that even shattered lives could be reassembled into something of value. It wasn't the life James had planned, but it was the one he had earned. And for the first time in many years, he faced it without lies. The end.
Thank you for watching. If you liked the story, like, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends. Thank you.